Okay, we are still in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. And so, just as we do, let's just kind of take a quick look. The overall context. These are things we've studied in the book of Hebrews, and we've been in Hebrews chapter 11 for a long time because it covers a bunch of Bible characters, and we've taken time to kind of study out their stories. The point is of Hebrews chapter 11, it's all about faith. And the examples that are given here are people who did things by faith. The Bible tells us that the just shall live by faith. Now, the Old Testament is where these things took place. And the Old Testament is where the original instruction of the just living by faith actually is. But then it's echoed in the New Testament. And in the day of the New Testament that we live in, there's a whole nother dimension of what living by faith is all about, and how that the spiritual realm uh, is more significant than the physical realm. And we have a deeper access and insight to all of that than they even had in the Old Testament. But these Old Testament characters are given to us to learn how to live by faith. And so we've looked at all of these, and the most recent one we did was the harlot Rahab. And so now we're coming to verse number 31, where the writer just throws in a ton of names. And today we're going to look specifically at Gideon and what we can learn from him and how the example of Gideon may fit us. Okay. So, verse 31 of Hebrews 11 says, "What shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets." Now, so what did these people do? We're collectively kind of throwing a bunch of stuff in here because I'm thinking that as uh, as the writer is writing, this chapter is getting longer and longer. And he's like, I can't keep going into details. I've got other things I want to say in chapter 12 and in chapter 13. So I'm going to kind of summarize. And so he just says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. So this is shotgun style, what these heroes did. So Gideon being one of these heroes, he did all of these great things, overcoming, victorious, winning. And I want to just really draw attention to the strength that they had, that they were made strong out of weakness, and to the valiance that they had. The Bible says here that they waxed valiant, which means they became valiant in fight. And so we're going to look at Gideon to see this in action here. But let's get a little context. Let's look at an Old Testament timeline, starting from creation and the garden up to the birth of Christ, just a rough, big picture breakdown of progression of times here. Now, the time of what went on in the garden itself is really impossible to know, but using Bible time indicators of how long things lasted, we can calculate back that the end of that was about 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. And so we have a time frame of just populating the earth, the flood, the Tower of Babel, that took pretty close to 2,000 years. And then we go to the age of the patriarchs, and we're going to, even though this is a lot shorter, only about 200 years, it's really significant with Abraham, Isaac, and all of that. Then they have the Israelites living in Egypt, and then going to the Exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land. We're looking at a little over 400 years there. And then the time of the judges, as the people of Israel begin to inhabit the promised land and establish themselves there, they are led by what the Bible calls judges rather than kings. And sometimes there's even more than one judge at the same time, but oftentimes it's one particular judge. Then that transitions into a kingdom. And I put the S there because this there's some changeover of whether it's one unified kingdom or a separate kingdom of Judah, kingdom of Israel, and so on. But the overall kingdom age went for around 500 years until they're taken into captivity. And there's even some overlap there. Taken into captivity for 70 years. And this is the time of like Daniel in the lion's den, things like that. And then restored. The restoration took a long time. And then after the kingdom is restored, then there's history that's not recorded in the Bible. We call it the silent years leading up to the birth of Christ. So this is kind of a big picture breakdown of the timeline of history from creation to the birth of Christ. And Hebrews chapter 11 makes reference to these various characters. Abel, Enoch, Noah, all of these stories took place during that populating the earth time. And then Hebrews 11 refers to Abraham and Sarah, his wife, and Isaac, his son, and Jacob, his son, and Joseph, his son. And these are the patriarchs that lived during that time frame there. And then Hebrews 11 tells us about Moses and about Rahab, which of course are taking place in the Exodus time. Now we come to the time of the judges, newly inhabiting the promised land, which was already inhabited, right? And the Lord driving out the enemies, but it doesn't happen overnight. And in the process, there are some ups and downs. And when you read the book of Judges, you find that the ups correspond to the people of God being faithful to God and obedient and practicing what God gave them to do. The downs correspond to the people of God becoming overconfident and self reliant and ignoring God and not doing what he said to do, but doing whatever they want to do. And God sent enemies to provoke Israel to turn back to God. And so during this time, we have these judges that God sends to deliver and to lead into victory, one of them being Gideon that we're studying today, another being Barak, who's mentioned in Hebrews 11, Samson, Jephthah, all mentioned in Hebrews 11. And then we come to the kingdom age. David is mentioned. Samuel is mentioned. Samuel is actually a transition figure from judges to kingdom. And the prophets. And the prophets, what they refer to as the prophets, all operated during that kingdom age and kind of overlapping into the captivity and restoration time. Now, there were prophets before the kingdom age. In fact, there's a prophet specifically in the story of Gideon. But the prophets are the ones who wrote the books that are in the Old Testament, that are the books of prophecy, starting with Isaiah. And they all operated during that kingdom age. So this is the Hall of Faith figures cover the entire Old Testament history. And so we're zeroing in on the age of the judges and Gideon here. Let's take a quick look at his story. And we're not going to really get into a ton of detail today. I just want to really show you one thing that I hope you'll be able to take to heart and will be an impact for you. And we'll just going to be pretty brief, I think. So Judges chapter 7 tells us about Gideon. And Hebrews 11 told us that Gideon and those others named there had a lot of victory, right? They put to flight the armies and they overcame and they escaped the edge of the sword and they quench the violence of fire, and all these things. So let's take a look at that happening here. Verse 1 says, Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon. Now let me pause really quick. A lot of times we might pronounce that name Jerubbaal. Jerubbaal. It's probably more like Jerubbaal, and I'm still certainly not really pronouncing it correctly, but it's two words. Baal or Baal is literally means Lord, but it was specifically a term that was used by pagans in reference to a specific god that they worshipped and called the Lord, but used a different name or different word and name than the true Lord God of all of Israel. Jerub means to grapple. And so this name was given to Gideon because he had thrown down an altar of Baal, which was the god of the Midianites, who were the current enemy. And so he boldly threw down this altar. And then when the people complained out of fear of what might happen, Gideon's dad said, let Baal contend for himself. Let Baal grapple or contend with Gideon. And so he named him Jerubbaal, which means for Baal to grapple with him, or for him to grapple with Baal and contend with. Uh, so then Jerubbaal, now we're past that and we are going into battle here. And we see this bold Gideon who had just thrown down this altar that everybody else is afraid of. Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Harod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said unto Gideon, The people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, Mine own hand hath saved me. Because remember, the reason the Israelites have gotten into trouble in the first place is because they got cocky, got overconfident, and forgot their need for God. And that's why God sent the Midianites as an enemy to overcome them. And so now he's saying, look, all right, you're going into a battle and you're kind of evenly matched here, to where when you win, it'll just be like, oh, yeah, we beat them. We're tougher. We're stronger. And so, what is this actual matchup here? Did the Israelites outnumber the Midianites to where it would be like an easy victory that they would claim credit for? Maybe they were probably like just evenly matched, right? Where it said, when we win, we'll feel like we did it. Well, there were 135,000 Midianites in this camp here, and this army that they're against. So how many Israelites do you think Gideon had with him? Well, he had 32,000. So 1 against 5. To me, that doesn't seem like too many. That doesn't seem like enough. You're trying to go against an army of 135,000 and you only have 32,000. You're outnumbered big time. But God's saying, nah, that's too many. That is just too many. I'm afraid even against these odds, that if and when you win, because I'm giving you the victory, you're not going to recognize that I gave it to you. You're going to think that you were able to do this task. You had the ability, you had the smarts, you had the strength, and you were able to do this on your own. So he told Gideon to just basically gather the whole army of 32,000 and just announce, hey, anybody that's afraid, just go home. We don't need you. It's no problem. You're not going to be looked down on. We're just going to let you go home. Anybody who's afraid. So 22,000 fearful Israelites went home. So now we're down to 10,000. That's more like it. 10,000, there's pretty much no way an army of 10,000 is going to defeat an army of 135,000. So this should be good, right? The Lord should be satisfied with this. But no, God said that's still too many. So now what I want you to do, Gideon, take the whole army down to the river so that they can drink. And pay attention to how they do it. Some people will get down on their knees at the riverbank and just drop their head into the water and just drink straight out of the river like that. Others will scoop water up in their hands and bring it to their face, and then they're going to lap it up. And he said, kind of like a dog laps up water. Now, there's all kind of cool things you can look into as to what those different techniques may indicate about a person or whatever. I'm not going to get into that today. I think there's a lot of different ways to look at that, and all of them could be fun. But we're just going to look at the numbers. Because God said, separate the ones who bring the water to their face. Just as you see them doing that, just tap them and say, hey, go stand over there. And so he gathered those people together, and then he just made an announcement to everybody else and said, go on home. We're just releasing you from the commission. You're heading home. So probably half and half. So now they're down to what, 5,000? Well, no. There were 9,700 who he sent home. And so now there are only 300 Israelites to overcome 135,000 Midianites. So these were odds that the Lord was satisfied with. So God is saying, when I give you this victory, when I give you this success, you need to know that it was me. So with 300 only, pretty much no way to take credit for it other than God giving the victory. But I just want to back us up here and say, had they gone in with 10,000 and won, that would still have only been because God gave the victory. Had they gone in with 32,000 and won, that would still be only because God gave the victory. Had they been evenly matched, if there had been 135,000 and they went out and overcame the Midianites, it's still because God gave the victory. So we just need to try to get it through our heads that anything good that happens in our lives, we need to be thankful. Anything that we are able to do, we are only able to do it because God allows us to. Jesus told Pontius Pilate, you wouldn't have any power unless my Father gave it to you. And the trick is to find that place of appreciation and that place of understanding to where we can give thanks to God from a deep and genuine and sincere place, recognizing that we owe God everything, even while things are what we might call good, so that God can leave us enjoying the good and not have to put us through something harder in order to help us appreciate. That's a challenge every day to get to a place of recognizing my complete and utter need for God, no matter how things look in my life, good or bad. Okay, so continuing the story, skipping down to verse 19, Gideon and the 300 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch. So it's nighttime, it's dark out. But they had newly set the watch. And they blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. So I'm pretty sure that most of these soldiers had two hands and not any more than two. So here we've got a trumpet in one hand and a pitcher in the other hand. What about the sword or the shield or maybe the bow? Well, this is the way that the Lord directed Gideon to bring them in. They took their 300 and divided into three camps of 100 each. So this is Gideon with his 100. And they surrounded the army of 135,000 without weapons in their hands. They had a trumpet and had a pitcher. This is the way the Lord directed them to do this thing. And it said the three companies blew the trumpets and they broke the pitchers because here's the secret, there were lamps in the pitchers. It's still not very scary. That they broke the pitchers, and so that revealed the light of the 300 men surrounding all of a sudden. Uh, and they held the lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal, and they cried, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." And somehow or another, 300 people, 300 trumpets, 300 shouts, 300 lanterns made enough of an impact that the Midianites stood every man in his place. I'm sorry, the Israelites stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host of the Midianites ran and cried and fled. So the 300 trumpets and lanterns and voices scared them bad enough that they took off. Well, the fact is, they were already scared. The Lord had already put the fear in their hearts. And a lot of times we think that our enemy is not scared of us, but he is. God has put the fear of you into our spiritual enemy, our adversary, the devil. He's scared of you. We don't need to be scared of him. He's scared of you because of what you can do through Christ. And these fled, and that's an example of Gideon doing what Hebrews 11 said, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. So look how bold Gideon is. He threw down the altar of Baal. He led this army against these Midianites, even though they were way outnumbered from the jump. And then he immediately responded when the Lord told him to send people home, send people home, send people home. That's bold. That's brave. That's courageous. This is what kind of guy Gideon is. Now, let's back up a chapter. Let's go to Judges chapter 6. The battle happens in chapter 7, so let's get the prequel, the backstory for Gideon. So verse 2 of chapter 6 says the hand of Midian was prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them dens, which are in the mountains, and caves and strongholds. So in other words, they were afraid. The children of Israel were afraid of the Midianites. So they're trying to hide. They're trying to fortify. They are not thinking about attacking. They are not thinking about overcoming. They're just trying to survive because they're afraid. And, like even when Gideon threw down the altar of Baal, they were afraid of what might happen to them because of that. So Gideon's not fearful, but these people are all fearful. Let's go to verse 11. It says, there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak, which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite and his son Gideon. So this angel came to the household of Gideon and his family, his father, and he's just kind of chilling under a tree. And then the Bible says in verse 12 that the angel of the Lord appeared unto Gideon and said unto him, the Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. So the angel declares what kind of person Gideon is, thou mighty man of valor, which we saw that play out in chapter 7. This guy went and did all of these things and led Israel into victory because he's what? A mighty man of valor. So the Lord apparently sent the angel to seek out this mighty man, to seek out this brave and courageous man, Gideon. Gideon must be just waiting for his moment to step up and do this thing because he is a mighty man of valor. Well, I didn't read all of verse 11 just then. Let's fill in a little extra detail to see what was Gideon doing when the angel found him and when the angel spoke to him. We know that all the Israelites, they're hiding and they're fortifying and they're trying to just duck under and just survive. But Gideon is a mighty man of valor, right? He's brave and courageous. So what was he doing that set him apart? Well, verse 11 said that his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Gideon was no different than anybody else. He was just as afraid of the Midianites as everyone else was. And what he's doing with his life is not impressive. And it is not the mark of a mighty man of valor. He's just trying to get some wheat. He's doing it down by the wine press where it can be more secretive. And he's trying to hide it from the Midianites just so that hopefully they'll have enough food to make it through the season. That's not brave. This is what kind of guy he was. This is what he was doing, living in fear just like everybody else. But God saw something in him, and God called him a mighty man of valor. Because the Bible says that God speaks things that be not as though they were. Doesn't mean he lied about stuff. It means he sees it before it happens. And he saw in Gideon who he can be, not who he was. He saw in Gideon what he could do, not what he was doing. Gideon's past and even his present meant nothing. Only the future that God had for Gideon meant anything here. And the key to accessing that future is what Hebrews 11 is all about, to do it by faith, to respond with faith. But Gideon's state was so unimpressive. I'm not pulling up the scriptures of the way the story proceeds here in this chapter. You can read it. I'll just summarize it. When he called him to do what he needed to do, Gideon didn't just, we say, okay, he did it by faith. He responded by faith. But Gideon's response by faith was not just instantly saying, okay, let's do it. If God spoke it, I believe it, that settles it, right? If you said it, then I'll do it. Now I don't need to be afraid because God spoke to me. No, he was still afraid. And he asked God to verify. And if you ever heard of putting a fleece before the Lord, that's because of what Gideon did here. A fleece being a sheepskin. He said, let me do this tonight. Let me lay out a fleece, a sheepskin on the ground. And then in the morning, don't let it have any dew on it. Let the dew be on the ground all around it, but not on the fleece. So he's saying, no, okay, trust but verify. I trust you, Lord, but I want to see you do something before my life is on the line for it. And God said, okay. Now, sometimes in these sorts of challenges, you may call it, God's not cool with it. And God said, no, you should have believed. You should have acted. But this time God said, okay, I'll do what you asked me to do. And it happened. He woke up the next morning. The fleece was dry. So now he should be convinced, right? No. Gideon asked for another. And he said, let me just run this back one more time. Tonight, I'll lay out a fleece on the ground, and tomorrow, let the fleece have the dew, and no dew on the ground. Now, there's no way this happens. This is not natural, and it just happened exactly the opposite the night before. But God said okay, and God sent him that verification. So, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that God sees more in you than you see in yourself. God has a destiny for you. God has intentions for you of what you can do, but not because you're capable, what you can do if you will believe. And God is patient. Don't be intimidated by God. Don't be intimidated by the examples of people who have done things with God's help, whether it be in Bible stories or people that you have witnessed in this life. Don't be intimidated. God has a plan for you. Respond by faith. And if that faith is a baby step forward, take that baby step. Remember the father of the boy who was plagued by the devil, who said, I believe, help my unbelief. If you're still going to struggle with some unbelief, go ahead and act on the belief that you have the best you can. Take the step you can take, and then take another step from there. But respond to the Lord and understanding that He is patient and that He will empower you. That's why Romans 8 says, if God be for us, who can be against us? In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. And it's why Philippians 4 says, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. You've got to believe that. You've got to believe that. Part of you does believe it. You've got to follow that part and let the part that doesn't believe it become subservient to the part that does. Take the steps you can take by faith to do what God has asked you to do and directed you to do. God will follow through. God will make you victorious. God will do more with you than you expect him to do, because that's just how he does it.